Okay.
Hello, MTI members. Welcome to Heat Treat Live, MTI's live webcast once or twice a month. We're excited you are here to talk about CQI-9. Before we get rolling with our panelists, I want to always remind everyone that if you look to your down at the bottom, you'll see a little button that says chat. Click on that to make sure that the chat box on the right will appear. And when you hear Rick and Bob talk about anything, you can either ask questions, or if someone asks a question in the chat box and you would like to provide an answer, because many of you are involved in CQI-9, you can answer each other's questions there. So please feel free to, where it says type message here in the bottom right, type in where you're listening from, your company name, and or just type questions in there as we go through this. So, so please do that. So before we get into the content, a couple of big MTI happenings happening right now. Today, you're going to get an email before the end of the day that F&A Virtual 2020, our big, huge trade show and conference, is gone virtual. And we've got an incredible promo video and the link to register going out today. So you're going to want to put that on your calendar. What is so exciting about F&A Virtual is we have what's called Bring the Team. So we've got an affordable pricing option that really makes it, we've taken the pricing obstacle out of the equation. It's only $199 for the first 2 attendees each, and then $49 for everyone after that. So if you brought 6 people from your company to F&A Virtual, where all this stuff, 100 exhibitors with all their latest product demonstrations, as well as 35 live technical sessions and 4 live sessions, panel discussions, all that beamed right through to your computer September 30th through October 2nd. You can do that for only $594. You get 6 people registered and they can all watch this and you can talk about it and see what did you learn, how does it apply to your plant, and how can you make 2021 a big success, because we all want to get out of 2020 with COVID, right? This is kind of crazy this year. So looking forward to that, and you're going to want to be a part of that action, that energy, and that knowledge. So second thing is our Yes Management Training Program, which sells out every year. It sells out so fast, we don't even print up brochures anymore. But because of COVID, we've taken 2020 class and moved it into 2021. And our 2021 class was almost sold out with only about 5 slots left. That's being moved to 2022. So if you've got some team member you want to bring into the next level in management, or if we've had presidents of companies go on this thing because they've never had any real big management training, go out to heattreat.net, our website, and click under training tab and click on the Yes Manager Training Program and register, get in now, because those 5 slots are going to go somewhere before the end of 20, and that's going to be the 22 class. So make sure you do that. And then we got big AMS 2750F. That is finally approved, will not be probably launched until March of next year because they got a couple of different elements to go through. But just like we're doing a deep dive into CQI-9 today, probably in September, we're going to be doing a big deep dive into the changes in AMS 2750F. MTI played a large part in some of those elements, and so we want to inform you on that. So we've got a speaker come along who's a real expert, has been deep in that process, who's going to come on and do a 4-hour a day for everybody here on Heat Treat Live. So put that on your calendar. It'll be sometime in September. We'll be sending out a survey and details here soon so you can register for that. But enough about MTI happenings. We've got lots going on, but today is all about CQI-9. And today we have Bob Ferry from FPM Heat Treat and Rick Metcalf with us and Guy from GM. And guys, take about 30 seconds and just share with people who you are. By the way, we were laughing before we came on because this literally is the largest registered MTI webcast we've done since I've been doing these for about a year now. So I didn't want to make these guys nervous, but I told them that with 1 minute to go.
Yeah.
So here we are with the largest crowd just for Bob and Rick. So Bob, we'll start with you. Share with everybody who Bob Ferry is.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Tom, for putting this together. And I'm Vice President of Engineering and Quality here at FPM Heat Treating. Certainly I'm on the Board of Trustees for MTI, and I volunteer to the AIAG CQI-9 committee. So that's all about me.
Well, Bob's done a great job for us as a volunteer, and I appreciate all you do, Bob. And Rick, what about you?
My name is Rick Metcalf. I work for General Motors. I've been there for 36 years. Started off in some sheet metal stamping areas and then progressed into heat treating in our plant, primarily with induction hardening of camshafts. And then we went into some furnace operations of steering knuckles and rocker arms. So I've got a little bit of a heat treat background. I worked in our plant for a while. Now I work in our product engineering group, helping to look at suppliers, doing a lot of what we call tassel visits, or a visit where we We look at the technical capability of a supplier, primarily from the material side and heat treating. Also do a lot of troubleshooting out there and failure analysis for our engine components. I work as a valve train materials engineer, so I work primarily in that area, but I do have other responsibilities for other components in the engine. So as with Bob, we've been working on the CQI-9 4th edition for a while now. We finally have it pretty well buttoned up, and it's published and available for people. Spend a lot of time on this edition trying to work out the little bugs and to try to make it easier to understand for heat treaters.
Well, thank you for that, Rick. When it comes to technical specifications, what people love to hear is making it easier in any capacity. So we appreciate that. So Rick, let's jump right into it. So pyrometry tables, they've changed in a lot of ways. And I know we spoke earlier about a lot of changes in them. So explain to the members what has changed and maybe a little bit of the why behind why they're changing.
So what we tried to do was, well, first of all, what we did is we revised the entire pyrometry section. We added the letter P in front of all the pyrometry items so that it would be specifically known this is a pyrometry item and not get confused with one of the process tables or with some of the element questions. So that was a minor thing, but we looked at every question. We tried to revise it to make it easier to understand. We tried to get rid of any ambiguity that might have been present in those questions. And we tried to set that up so that couple of things. One is easier to understand, easier to translate into other languages, and easier to implement. So some of the things we did for that, other than we basically started with adding a lot of things to the glossary. Pyrometry is a difficult section to understand and to follow, and it certainly is for me. So we added as a group more definitions to make it easier to understand for people, easier to follow. Some of the definitions, some of the terminology without a definition, it gets hard to follow. So we tried to make that easier to understand. We now allow RTDs as a thermocouple. Previous editions did not allow that. Now RTDs are allowed for thermocouple usage, and they're treated the same as a noble thermocouple.
Right.
We've changed some of our maximum usage periods for expendable and non-expendable thermocouples. So for example, expendable thermocouples are now good for 1 year, regardless of what temperature excursions that they see. And then the non-expendable are good for 2 years, also regardless of whatever temperature excursions they see. The 3rd edition had some limitations for when you could use one versus the other and multiple usages if you were under a certain temperature, and we eliminated a lot of those just to make it easier to follow. We also defined thermocouple usage for the SAT, and the probe methods A and B. We only allow thermocouples N, B, R, and S for this section. It's a little bit easier to follow. We also redefined some of the alternatives for a temperature uniformity survey. If your furnace doesn't allow it, we went in, we revised that section. Now, previously it was, if you used a temperature universe, a property survey, you had to go in every month and produce another property survey. Now we've expanded that to only being required every 6 months if you meet a couple of limitations. And those limitations aren't really that bad. They're pretty self-explanatory. One is all the thermocouples monitoring your process are under control and within the limits you expect. The other one is, a written procedure for how you do a property survey, what properties to look at, how often to look at, what are acceptable and non-acceptable results. So it was pretty much an expansion of property surveys to allow better usage of them, make it a little bit less complicated.
Yeah, and one of the things on that property survey is we said that the property survey is there just in case you couldn't do a normal TUS. In other words, if the furnace is capable of doing a normal TUS on it, we want you to use thermocouples and do the 9-point survey or based on the size of your qualified work zone in order to ensure that you're meeting the temperature requirements of the furnace, not necessarily just a property survey, right, Rick?
Oh, that's right. And that's pretty well defined inside the 4th edition. There's a pretty nice section on just alternative TUSs and property surveys and the rules for modifying those. So it is easier to use now than it was. But once again, just as Bob said, we really want you to use the thermocouples. That's the best way to understand the temperature within your furnace.
Right.
The other thing I was going to say is we increased the maximum allowable offsets for calibration errors, for SATs, and for the center a TUS survey. It was plus or minus 2 degrees C in the 3rd edition, and we've increased that to plus or minus 3 degrees C for the 4th edition. We also clearly defined the grace periods for when you can do a calibrated thermocouple. There's less ambiguity. I think almost everything is 2 weeks for a grace period. I know the calibration calibration cycles are 3 days, but everything else is 2 weeks. And we expect if you go outside of that grace period, then we will not. Our goal was to not allow you to run an operation without having a certified or a calibration that was in, what do I want to say?
Intolerance that was
intolerance,
performed,
yes.
right?
And within the grace period, within the period that was defined for. We don't want you using your furnace if you're 2 weeks past the next calibration cycle, or more than 2 weeks past. So we tried to define what those time limitations were.
Right.
And there's several other changes within the thermocouple section, within the whole pyrometry section. It's pretty well laid out. In the beginning of the 4th edition, there's a page that goes through some of those changes and why they're there. Not necessarily why, but the why is to make it easier to understand.
Right.
That's been our primary goal for the 4th edition, was to make it easier to follow, easier to implement, and easier for people to understand.
And certainly, like when you mentioned the grace periods, I mean, when you're given a 2-week grace period on a TUS, you know, what that shows you is that the OEM certainly understand how things can come up and how production constraints can limit when you can get in and do the TUS. However, you know, if you look at it compared to like AMS 2750, 2 weeks is a long time.
Yeah.
Compared to what you're allowed on 2750, you're allowed a couple of days, right? So this is, we feel like this is more doable. And again, it's geared towards, you know, producing good quality product and not being so stringent as AMS 2050 had been. And Rick was around when they did revision 3 and they got rid of AMS 2750, right, Rick?
Right. Yep. I was around for that one. That was when we originally rewrote the whole pyrometry section and got rid of references to 2750 so that CQI-9 would be more of a standalone document.
Right. And the advantage there, you know, at first I was concerned about it because I thought, well, all right, here we go. Now we're going to have another pyrometry standard that we have to meet, and we have to, and still, if you're doing aerospace work, you still got to meet 2750. But what it turned out to be is, you know, now looking at where AMS 2750 is going or where it went, it's even gotten more stringent. So what we're doing here is creating the automotive standard that makes it easier to live with and still gives you good quality product, is what I feel, without all these restrictions that AMS 2750 is growing into.
So Bob, from the heat treater standpoint and looking at all that, is there any place where you feel like a heat treater could get tripped up if they're not paying attention and reading the spec really close? I mean, is there any one part of that you'd want to tell them to pay close attention to when making the shift to the new standard?
Well, I think one of the things, as Rick mentioned earlier, with the standard is, the format has changed in the way that we set the standard up, such that, you know, we used to have element questions that were in the form of paragraphs, and each paragraph had like 3 or 4 shall statements in it. And what has happened is we've broken that down into a separate, you know, it's a element question, but each shall statement has its own section underneath that question.
Right.
So it makes it a lot easier to follow through and to capture all of the requirements that CQI-9 is really asking for. What they said, what the OEM said that they found out in the field is occasionally people would see this big question and they caught 3 of the 4 shall statements, but they didn't catch the 4th one. So,
Right.
but they thought they did, but they weren't in compliance. So they wanted to say, well, let's break this thing down and make this easier to understand, and that helps the flow of the whole whole assessment, the whole audit.
Right.
So I think from that standpoint, it helps break it apart so that it clearly defines what the requirements are.
Right.
And I think that helps with being able to be compliant, because the heat treaters out there, they just want to know what they got to do to be compliant. They're not trying to do a bad job. They want to do a good job. So as long as you can tell them specifically what the requirements are, I think it makes it a lot easier to follow that way.
Right.
And even the pyrometry section, we've reworded a lot of things to try to clarify it, to make the requirements stand out for even following temperature uniformities and SATs. The SAT, we had some schematics on what an SAT is for and how to perform each one that's allowable. And we've revamped them to try to make that easier to understand as well, with examples of the calculations and everything in the document. So I think that's a good thing to help show people or heat treaters out there how to be compliant when you're doing that testing.
So Rick, thanks for those comments about it. So anything else on the pyrometry tables, Rick?
The other thing was, a big item that I didn't mention was for the 4th edition, there is a requirement to go digital. We're trying to eliminate the analog section of pyrometry. And so what we've done is added a requirement that within 3 years, we're requiring that all new CQI-9 self-assessments after this 3-year period would be, we're expecting to see digital equipment being used. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It gives us better accuracy, it gives us better statistical capability and analysis of the data, better storage of data. It's interesting going into a plant, you see a paper recorder for temperature, and some days it's been running for 2 or 3 weeks or longer on the same chart. And so it's hard to pull up individual things that might have happened in there.
Right.
So I think being digital makes it a lot easier to do troubleshooting, a lot easier to keep your process under control, and potentially with tighter limits than what we're using before. So there's a lot of good things with that, with trying to, and you know, when you look at other industries, almost everybody's going digital. So it's a good thing for us to start looking at that.
So a big question that pops into my mind, Rick, for you as an OEM, given emerging technologies, connectivity, Industry 4.0, which is a huge thing about connecting supply chains vertically and horizontally, if it's moved to digital, do you ever see where the OEM and the supplier systems are talking together in real time at all?
I have not seen that yet, but boy, that's great. I mean, that would be maybe not so much the OEM, but specifically for tiered suppliers. I mean, if you could see how your heat treat operation is affecting a machining operation or vice versa, and link those together, especially for somebody who has an assembly with 3 or 4 different heat treated parts. It'd be nice to see how did this heat treat lot compare to the machinability of that lot? and going back and forth. And so I think from that perspective, it does enable us to do things that we weren't able to do before.
Right, right. Now, Bob, hearing all the digital stuff, I mean, I'm sure some people listening are still in analog potentially. So I want to ask you as a heat treater, I know y'all have gone through that process. What do you feel are some best practices or mindsets that people that are guys still have a lot of analog technology or some to moving to into the digital realm? Is there things they should be thinking about or questions they should be asking?
Well, certainly when it comes to analog instrumentation, it's getting harder and harder to find those instruments to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But the components are becoming obsolete. Eventually they've got to look down the road and see the light at the end of this tunnel, that analog instruments are going to be a thing of the past. I think everybody does recognize that, but more importantly, because this standard or this document is covering a worldwide supply chain, you have heat treaters in third world countries that they're getting used equipment and they're making the analog instruments work, but we're trying to tell them that you got to start thinking about moving on to the next level, and this is going to be hopefully the push that they need. But they've also extended the length of time. Like it's 3 years from the release of this document that you have to be digital, right? So that should give you plenty of time to plan your capital to make those changes and to jump into the next technology level, to give you a good processing fingerprint for all the work that you're performing for your customer and your OEM. So I think it's all a good thing for everyone, and they've got time to do it.
Well, I know I'm about as a futuristic guy as you can get in terms of looking at technology, but I know when you're changing data from one set to a futuristic set, especially analog to data in any industry, it's kind of like, let's wait till the last possible moment to put that up. So to encourage people to want to do it now sooner than later, Bob, what are if you could, I know I'm probably asking this spontaneously, but what are some of the benefits of being digital versus analog? I mean, I guess faster data recognition, real-time.
Oh, absolutely. It's like real-time data acquisition from your desk or even off location. You can dial in and you can see exactly what the furnace is doing, while you got a job running, and you're collecting all that data, right? But besides that, you can utilize this digital data if you're collecting more than just temperature. If you're collecting temperature and for atmosphere furnaces, you collect your carbon potentials, your gas flows. You start collecting all this data, and all of a sudden, you can start paying attention to how the furnace is behaving and compare that against your other furnaces to try to improve efficiencies.
Right.
And the bottom line is you're trying to be statistically competent more than just provide a good heat treat that meets the hardness, right? You want to be able to make sure that you're falling within the spec limits, but you're in good control of those limits. And the best way to do that is with the digital data. And utilizing that data to improve your operation and improve your process. And you may even use it for a preventative maintenance standpoint to see when things are starting to maybe tail off to where you have to go make an adjustment on the furnace, right? Or go see what's going on, check it out and figure out what's going on with that furnace. So I think it's all good for that kind of data collection and analysis in order to be a better heat treater.
So based off of all of that, from an OEM perspective, I think it's great that you can superimpose one set of data on top of the other. You can look at how is the atmosphere changing? How is the temperature changing? How were those controlled together? And then how does that affect your output? But even more than that, it really gives you a leg up on what you mentioned earlier, Bob, about competing with third world countries and very inexpensive heat treating processes. you end up getting what you're paying for, but not necessarily from a cost perspective. It's the whole ability to control your process better, to prevent spills, to being able to get a nice reproducible process that gives you consistent results. And that's what we're looking for. Before CQI-9, we used to have some pretty horrendous heat treat spills out there that cost hundreds of millions of dollars for each spill. And after CQI-9 and paying attention to the details there, our warranty rates have gone down a lot. We're able to prevent a lot of the spills that used to be pretty commonplace 20 years ago.
So from an OEM, Rick, when you're looking at this is just kind of a blatant competition question. When you're looking at several supplier heat treaters and you've got one that's a lot of analog and one that's all digital, does that play an influential part of the decision? Does it tell you anything about a heat treater? Like, you know what? They're invested in technology. They're moving forward. I mean, does that difference? I'm trying to help people understand why the reason to really move sooner than later. Does it play in the decision when you see that?
Oh, certainly it does. I mean, if I go into a heat treater and I see that they have everything is digital, they have people that can look at a process from home. You have your key people that can look at how the process is running, can troubleshoot it. All of those things make it a better sell for that supplier than for someone who's heavily invested in analog, where someone who's knowledgeable has to be there every minute that you're running the process if you don't want to have something get through that wasn't predictable.
Right.
So from that perspective, I really look at digital as being certainly an enhancement from a product engineering, a technical perspective.
Gotcha. That sounds good. So Bob, I know we talked about the assessment question area, and there's some pretty big changes in there. So how will the assessment area be changing?
Well, yeah, I probably jumped that question, but it's essentially where we've changed that whole format from the paragraphs to the individual sections under each element question, to where it makes it clearer, easier to understand, and it captures all of the shalls that need.
Okay, okay, I know what you're referring to now. Yep.
Okay, so that was the main thing that happened under the question, the heat treat assessment questions. Certainly, we also added a column for objective evidence, because one of the things that we were finding with self-assessments is they check okay, not okay. Well, typically they just check okay, and there's no evidence of anything in their system that pointed to what that question was, and that wasn't the intent of the CQI-9. Because when you have an auditor come, like a tier 1 or even an OEM come and do the CQI-9 assessment with you, they want to see the objective evidence, and they want to see that you have ties from the CQI-9 into your objective evidence in your quality system. And so that wasn't always coming through. So now we put in a column for objective evidence, and we're hoping that they fill that in with their quality document numbers.
Right. Now, Rick, go ahead, Rick. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, from my perspective, I really like that also. Looking at self-assessments that suppliers did, got sent hundreds of them. So when you go through those, and maybe they only answered one of the questions. They answered the easiest shall that was in that segment, and they didn't answer the others. Then you had to go and start digging for more information and trying to get that back from the person who did the self-assessment, and then getting into the process tables and trying to see how did the responses in the process tables relate to the element questions. And it's so much easier to do when each of those objective evidences are individually filled out for each of the questions. It's easier for someone who did not do the assessment to understand what actually happened. And so it's easier to review an assessment and understand exactly what the heat treater was trying to convey.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sorry. But as far as the assessment questions go, it is one of those one of those things where they wanted to make sure that everything got captured. And I was surprised to see that the OEMs really get a lot of these CQI-9 assessments from heat treaters through the tier ones. They do get to the OEMs, and the OEMs aren't able to go visit every heat treater, right?
Right.
So the only way they know your company is by your assessment that you send in. And if you don't have any objective evidence or any other supporting documents, it makes it very difficult for them to make a decision on what kind of heat treater this really is.
Right. Right.
And it moves you up closer to the list of having somebody needing to visit you. And I know that those are a pain to prepare for. And so if you can avoid us coming in, that's probably better.
Well, Rick, so you'd mentioned the glossary section and how it's expanded. Is there any examples that you could point to of how it's changed and some of the things that it expanded on?
Yeah, we have, I think we added like 20% more, quite more
Words, verbs.
words and
Yeah.
definitions than we had before. We added some illustrations. We tried to go through, and whenever somebody had a question about pyrometry or one of the process tables, our first thought was, well, add that to the glossary. So we expanded the glossary with the questions that we had going through and trying to put the assessment together. I'm hoping that you now have a source in the back of the manual to go to if you have any questions about, well, you know, I define it this way, but you might define it some other way. And especially when it gets into some of the pyrometry section verbiage, some of those phrases and can be construed differently. So this way here we have a clear definition of what those terms are.
Right. Even when you're mentioning like expendable and non-expendable thermocouples, I mean, things like that, they need a definition just to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
So there's huge clarity here.
Yeah.
Right.
Much
And that was
more
our
for the
goal
clarity.
with the 4th edition, was to try to add clarity to as many areas as we could. Our first attempt at the pyrometry section was with the 3rd edition, and we know we missed some things. So this time around, we hope to catch those and to make it easier to understand.
Awesome. Now, Bob, when we were talking about this earlier in preparation for this, you mentioned a couple a technical area or two that the heat treaters want to be paying attention to. What kind of technical areas do they want to really zero in on in the spec?
Well, I think they should refresh themselves with that pyrometry section to make sure that they are meeting all those requirements. As we mentioned, if you were doing any property surveys in place of temperature uniformity surveys, you should really take a look at that document, because it states that you have to be doing temperature uniformity surveys with thermocouples as opposed to property surveys, unless your furnace is of such a design that you cannot do a temperature uniformity survey. So that's one area that can jump up and get you if you haven't been doing it that way. Certainly, we've added things to like the process tables to where we put more focus on the quenching process. So you'll see some quenching process requirements show up in the process tables that maybe not were there before. For example, like high pressure gas quenching, not everybody's high pressure gas quench is the same. So there's going to be some parameters or some things that you have to look at, whether it be pressure, flow, fan speeds. You know, you have to monitor your or agitation rates. You've got to monitor that quenching process better than what we had done in revision 3.
Right.
So, but you know, like for aluminum, there's several different ways that you can quench that, and they put some restrictions in the document to help you along with what you're supposed to be watching, as well as quench delays and temper delays. Those are also additional requirements that have shown up in some of the process tables, but we've added them to others as well.
Awesome. So Rick, you're an OEM, you're the guy from GM, and a lot of our heat treaters are like, what is he thinking? When you look at revision 4, when it's all said and done, when you're looking at selecting a heat treater versus not selecting a heat treater, what are some best practices and improvements that you see that definitely put a heat treater ahead of others in terms of being chosen as a supplier?
Well, one of the things that I really look at being a metallurgist, I want to go into the process, to the materials lab, and look at what exactly they're doing. We did add a statement to all of the process tables where a microstructure was required, that the supplier have some kind of reference acceptable microstructures and have that available for their operators to use during regular inspection. I think that's really important. I look at that for a supplier. If they're just looking at the print that says, hey, I have a certain case depth, effective case depth, a total case depth, and the microstructure should be martensite. If that's all that a supplier is looking for in their lab, to me, that's not really enough. I like to have a set of visual photographs available that says, this is okay, this is not okay, and maybe something that's marginal. But something that helps the operator to understand what's good practice. What should I be looking for in terms of an acceptable microstructure? So for me, I look at, does the heat treat lab have acceptable microstructures present? Do they have the process tables filled out correctly? Are you looking at all of the different questions in the process table, answering them? Are you doing the process tables talk about a lot of temperature uniformity surveys and when to do them. Talks about tolerances for atmosphere control. Those things we're looking for also. But for me, I try to look mostly at microstructure. How is a supplier controlling that? How does he know whether it's good or bad? Certainly having some kind of indication in the lab of what we should be running to. And then certainly a digital, having digital controls, having tighter limits for everything. To me, I don't want to say tighter limits for everything. That's not a good statement. Making sure that your process is well contained within the acceptable limits is what is the requirement. Now, anything we can do to try to eliminate spills, to try to reduce the frequency, is good for both the heat treater and for the OEM. So that's where I'm looking for.
Awesome. Any follow-up comments to that, Bob?
I certainly agree with Rick. I think the key is, to make sure that all the product coming out of heat treaters' door is 100% good. We don't want any product spills out in the industry, and I think most heat treaters are probably not going to have a problem with revision 4 compared to revision 3. It's just because it makes it clearer as to what the requirements are, I think.
Right.
So yeah, I think this is going to be a good thing for our industry.
So knowledge is power, and knowledge is key anytime there's a change in specs. So I think both of you mentioned that AUG is coming out with some training modules or something sometime soon. Could y'all speak to that just a little bit?
Yes, they are. Right now, they're working on a changes presentation. And in the near future, they're planning on putting out some kind of a webinar presentation for the changes of CQI-9. They haven't really established how that's going to be happening yet, right, Rick? They just mentioned that we're putting this document together. It's actually a PowerPoint, but they're going to go through, it's going to list all the specific changes that we recognize that were made in the document from revision 3 to revision 4. And it's going to be presented by several different people out of the committee and the OEMs. So that's what they're focusing on right now. And they haven't got the document, or they haven't got the PowerPoint completed yet. So they haven't been able to establish a time when they're going to do it, but we're trying to wrap this thing up. I think, certainly this month we'll have the thing wrapped up as far as the changes document presentation goes, and then we'll have to wait for AIG to announce that. One thing I will say is AIG, we thought could have done a better job of letting people know that this document was released.
I know,
So,
I
so
know
we're hoping this helps.
well, that's why we exist, Bob. We're bringing it to the street. We're bringing it to the street. You're hearing it right here. Breaking news.
Yeah, honestly, because we were on the committee and we didn't know it was released until they told us at our next committee meeting.
It's kind of like,
oh yeah, we released that.
It's kind of like finding out your girlfriend broke up with you on Facebook, right?
Yeah, yeah. So,
well, hey, so there's a great question from Andrew. So either of y'all answer this. Do you have a recommendation for a resource regarding microstructure example photos? Me.
That is something that's difficult to do. What we try to do is, as a supplier as a heat treater is starting their process, photograph some good parts.
Mhm.
Usually we end up having a beta and a gamma development phase before we go into production. We like to look at parts that come off of tests, good parts and bad, and document what those microstructures look like. That's one key thing that the OEM can help you with is if you're looking for microstructure photos, we can segregate parts that did come off of test and provide those to you to be able to take a sample, be able to take a microstructure photo of to use for a good sample. It's always hard to find bad samples, but at least I'm hoping it's very difficult to come up with the bad ones. But for the most part, we're looking at samples that, hey, this is what we typically see. It's really great if you can identify, I don't know how, everybody has different skill levels of the technicians in their lab. So that is a key part of educating those people. There should be a training process. People in your lab, hey, do you know the difference between martensite and ferrite? Hey, just because they're white doesn't mean they're the same thing. How do you etch these differently? And knowing, hey, you can get retained austenite, but not under these circumstances. So a little bit of education is good, but also having the photographs are great. I have not found a source out there where I can go to and say, hey, this is a nice microstructure of a 1050 product. ASM, I think 8th edition used to have some things in microstructure and metallography. It's an old book. It was the black binders from 25, 40 years ago maybe. But they used to have some good microstructure photos in them. The latest editions, I don't think, have as many acceptable pictures. But work with your OEM, work with your tiered suppliers, and try to develop what's good and what's bad. Certainly the good ones we can do. The hard one, the difficult ones are trying to produce the bad microstructures. And we don't want to produce them on purpose, but save your parts. When you see something that's questionable, use that as a reference photo.
Training example, that's a good idea. Typically, if you're running particular products, like a certain group of products or series of products, that's a particular material, say it's case hardening, but it'd be best to develop your own photographs as to what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And but there are other resources, as Rick mentioned. You can go to the ASM handbooks. They do have microstructure photographs in the ASM handbook, and maybe you can, capture some of your own to create a reference document. I know I've even seen some specifications come through that have gone through that trouble of developing their own microstructure standards, and we were fortunate enough to use that as a reference to set up our own standards. So there are things out there, but it's going to take a little bit of legwork in order to develop them into something that's going to be usable for what you're doing.
So before I ask the super big question on everybody's mind, any final comments from Bob, you or Rick, just on the technical aspects of anything we've talked about today that you feel like you want to reinforce or that we've left out?
Well, go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say, well, certainly read the document. I mean, there are some subtle changes in there There's some clarifications. There are some rule changes. We talked about the temperature uniformity surveys. We talked about some of the acceptable usage life for thermocouples. There are some modifications to those. Hopefully we made it easier to understand, but I don't think there's any really big, huge technology changes. We do allow RTDs, and we are trying to get away from analog. And I think those two are probably some of the biggest issues, but those are the ones that I can think of.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you've hit on the top or the major sections, the major things that are changes from revision 3 to revision 4. So yeah, I just think it was more of a clarity issue that we wanted to clear things up. And as I mentioned, it is an international standard, and we do have people on the committee that are in Europe, and they're trying to do the translations, and a lot of time the wording doesn't match. So that's why we have to go and reword everything so that they fully understand what the translation of that document means. So,
but lost in translation is not an excuse for non-compliance, right?
No, they don't accept it.
So the big question in everybody's mind, I know you got 3 years to come into compliance with digital. So the big question in everybody's mind is, what is the date for compliance to revision 4? Is this the land of the law? I mean, how long does the revision 3 hold up?
Well, from General Motors' perspective, our supplier quality group is looking at any new assessments performed after August 1st. So right now, the 4th edition is the only acceptable version for new self-assessments.
Okay.
Yeah, now, and when we were in the committee, I pretty much heard similar with Ford, that they said that they would expect you on your next assessment, your next heat treat assessment that you have planned, to go into the revision 4 assessment instead of revision 3.
So that's not a universal, absolute universal date. Could an OEM could choose to do December 1st if they wanted to, and it's up to them?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, okay, so if you've already done your heat treat assessment for this year, for 2020, say you did it in March, your next assessment isn't due until March of 2021.
Gotcha.
Right? So that means you've got to March of 2021. Now, I don't recommend that you wait until March to start doing the assessment.
Right. Get
revision 4 and start planning it through a little bit ahead of time. Maybe in January you start going through this thing. But so you do have time to get it. Now, there's always that caveat in CQI-9 where your customer can require you to do something different, right? And I always hate hearing that, but the tier 1 could demand that you do a revision 4 this year. That's the only caveat to that.
Right. So if you haven't done an assessment this year for whatever reason, would it be smart to at least connect with your OEM just to verify when that date is, or you think they'll all go August?
No, I think it would be smart to connect to your OEM. As Rick mentioned, that's how General Motors is looking at it. Ford may be looking at it differently, and FCA's could be something different again.
Right. That's what I wanted to clarify, because I know some specs, at least in aerospace, when it's released, there's a date that it's going to be the law of the land. So if it's fluctuating, hear that, members, call your OEMs and verify when that date is, because it could be different.
Right.
All right. Well, Bob, Rick, we've come to the last portion. Thank you so much for your time today. We answered every question on the chat line, which is good. So I hope everybody got informed, got what they needed. Anybody that wants to rewatch this, we're going to be downloading it, and it'll be up tonight and posted out tomorrow. So you'll be able to spread it to your team tomorrow for them to actually listen to and watch. You'll want to make sure that you put on your calendar August 25th. We've got a special edition of Heat Treat Live. We're going to have the 4 top executive leaders in MTI, with Jim Oakes from Super System as our president. Jamie Jones is the immediate past president from Solar Atmospheres. Don Hendry is the incoming president from Pinson Valley Heat Treat. And then Jim Orr from Pentaflame Tech Industries as our treasurer. You're going to be able to ask them whatever questions you'd like to ask them. You're going to get to ask questions through the eyes of our key leadership on what are they seeing in 2020 in terms of COVID and its impact, the heat treating industry in general. Furnaces North America, why should you bring your teams into the virtual world of Furnaces North America to see the latest things? So it's your leadership, heat treaters and suppliers just like you, that's going to be telling you their thoughts on where they think we are today and what they see through the eyes of things we've been studying for the future. So you're not going to want to miss that. If you're an owner operator, you just want key management to hear from the perspective of some of the key leaders. You want to put August 25th. You'll be getting an invite very soon for that date. So put August 25th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on your calendar. So gentlemen, Bob, Rick, thank you very much for your time. Members, thank you for your time and listening. Because you remember always, we love you guys and ladies. You're not just strong, you're MTI strong. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.